so much for having me here today. It is a really special moment for me to be able to speak to you all about wellness, leadership, and empowerment, especially since my life experiences have really taught me the true meaning of these words. The end of my second year of medical school, which was about 9 years ago, was one of the lowest points in my life. The stress of medical school and other personal issues was really taking a mental toll on me. I wasn't eating well, I couldn't sleep at night, I just wasn't myself. My panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder was at its worst, to the point I became agoraphobic, which means you fear and avoid places or situations that might cause you to panic and make you feel trapped, helpless, or embarrassed. Agoraphobia had confined my world to my home. I remember feeling an intense sense of fear when leaving my house, driving, being in open spaces, in crowded places, and many other situations. I would get hot and shake, and my heart would race. My muscles would all tighten up, and I would have feelings of depersonalization, which was probably the worst symptom for me. Depersonalization is a feeling of unreality where you feel disconnected from the world and your body. It's almost like you're in a dream. Even within my own home, I would feel fear, which perhaps some of you may experience, but for those of you who do not, can you imagine that? I mean, with quarantine happening, maybe you can, but it was like my world was closing in, and when it was evening time, I would just retract to my room where I felt the safest. My room was my comfort zone where I would spend a lot of my time until one night I was just sitting on my bed reading a book when I suddenly felt a pang of fear run through my body and my heart start racing, and I felt like I was falling. I started to scream for help, and I banged on my nightstand to feel grounded. I rushed downstairs, my body shaking, to tell my parents that I was losing it and to please help me. My poor parents, worried sick, hurried me to the emergency room. But it did not make sense. I have a supportive home. Why was I feeling this way? That night, as I lay on the hospital bed, I felt so scared that even my comfort zone was not safe anymore. The place where I felt the most secure turned out to be the place where I had a panic attack. Where was I to go? Where could I feel safe? Even though that was a very difficult night, I had a huge epiphany after that. I realized that there was no such thing as a safe zone. Even if nowhere was safe, then everywhere was safe. I concluded that feeling safe was not connected to my physical location, but rather my state of mind. And I could find peace within myself. I was looking for security elsewhere when I needed to become patient and search for it within myself. So how many of you have made decisions due to the fact that it was a safe choice? Well, I chose medical school because it was a safe option for me. To become a doctor and a great leader was always my dream. Ever since I was a child, I knew I was going to be a doctor, whether it was the natural influence of my dad being a physician or the outside pressure and expectations from the South Asian community. It was just settled. My desire to help people, my natural inclination towards leadership and being a support to others. I felt that being a physician was my only path. However, when anxiety became debilitating and I found myself struggling mentally, emotionally, and physically, I felt that dream slipping away. But I pushed forward. I had to start learning to not only support others, but also support myself. After a few more emergency room visits due to severe panic attacks, my parents pleaded that I drop out of medical school and focus on my health. They also advised me to consider a different career path. Although I refuted my parents in the beginning, eventually I recognized that maybe being a physician wasn't the right path for me and that I needed to let that dream go. I'll be honest, it was one of the hardest decisions of my life, and I felt like a complete failure. I felt my whole world crumbling around me. I sensed that I let myself down, and worse, I felt like I let my parents down, even though I know they did not feel that way. That was a very depressing time in my life, and as I tackled feelings of failure and uncertainty, I felt so lost. I always had a vision in mind, I always knew what I was going to do, and now all of a sudden, I had no idea where I was going. Nonetheless, my aspiration to help people was still there, and I had faith that I could turn things around. I continued therapy. I was on medications as well. I began to work out frequently, eat healthy, and work on my sleep hygiene. I basically worked on rudimentary lifestyle changes to improve my life and my own health. Additionally, I started meditating and praying more. I looked inward and turned towards my faith for guidance. In the Quran, it says, "Verily, with hardship, there is relief," which gave me the power to carry on. All these changes had a drastic impact on my overall wellness. Meanwhile, I chose to do my master's in industrial organizational psychology, which is the study of human behavior relating to work. I dropped out of med school in March and I started my master's in May. I was determined. And after 9 years of battling with anxiety and panic disorder, I finally was off my medications and I felt like my old self again. I regained that freedom that anxiety had once stolen from me. In 2018, I went on to do a Tedx talk on overcoming anxiety. I stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people talking about my most vulnerable moments. And I will admit that was not easy. I was shaking and nervous and anxious, but I got through it. However, I was deeply humbled by the positive response that I received. I got hundreds of messages from people all around the world, and I still do to this day, who expressed that my talk not only helped them, but also served as a source of hope and inspiration for them. And that meant more to me than anything. At that moment, I truly realized that I was fulfilling my life's purpose and that my previous view of helping people was so narrow. I thought I had to be a doctor in order to help people. But the reality is there's so many ways to serve people. And what is this path but another one that heals those I can touch? This actualization led me to continue being an advocate for anxiety and break the stigma. We need to address these issues rather than hiding from them and begin to take actions towards solutions. I want to give a voice to those who have none, to those who are afraid to get help or share with their loved ones for being seen as weak. I want to normalize speaking about our struggles and mental health. So I went on to write a book about work-related stress and general stress, and ultimately how you can become more productive when you learn to navigate these stressors. My book is expected to publish in April 2021, inshallah, and my hopes are that this book will empower those who grapple with high levels of stress and in life. Simon Sinek, one of the most influential voices in the leadership world, said, "The single most valuable thing you will ever learn in your life is to accept help when offered and to ask for help when you know you can't do it." Wellness can mean helping others and accepting help when needed. We cannot deny the pain we experience. We must confront it and work towards betterment. Try this the next time you're feeling anxious. Compliment someone and say, you could say, "Oh, wow, you have a beautiful smile," or eyes, or "I love your energy." And just notice a shift in your mindset and mood. This works for me all the time. Many of the accomplishments people acquire come as a result of a personal crisis. And that was the case with me. My idea of what a leader looks like dramatically changed as I gained more knowledge and life experiences. Now, let me ask you this. What do you think of when you think of a leader? What image comes to your mind? Let me guess, a CEO, president, maybe a doctor? But researchers have found that 30% of leaders get into a leadership position based on their age, sex, race, and attractiveness. But leadership has nothing to do with your job title or your genetics. It comes from within. When you think of a leader, you probably think of an extrovert as well, which is true. They are more likely to get leadership positions, even though introverts are likely to make better leaders because they tend to be better listeners. They spend more time self-reflecting and preparing, which are all important characteristics of a good leader. Psychologist Tim Judge found that altruistic, empathetic, and sociable people are likely to make better leaders, but less likely to be chosen to lead. When many think of leaders, they seldom think of Islamic women as leaders, but the truth is, Islam gave rights to women back in the time of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. The Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam worked for his wife Khadija initially as she was a successful businesswoman, and his wife was actually older than him. In Islamic history, women participated in government, public affairs, and teaching. In Islam, women are encouraged to actively participate in improving, serving, and leading different aspects of their community. It is important not to confuse culture with religion in these matters. There are two quotes that I just love, which I really feel encompass the meaning of a leader. One is from John Quincy Adams, and he said, "If your actions inspire others to dream more, to learn more, to do more, and become more, you are a leader." And the other by Simon Sinek again, "If you decide to look after the person to the right of you and to the person to the left of you, you have become a leader." So tell me this, isn't a mother a leader who puts her child's needs in front of her own? Or a brave high schooler who stands up against injustice, against a schoolmate who's getting bullied? Or a woman breaking the glass ceiling? Now, I'm not trying to discredit leaders and their hard work by giving everyone a participation award. What I'm saying is there is a potential to be a leader in each and every one of you. Leaders have the amazing ability to rally people together and get them passionate about achieving a shared goal. The key to being a good leader is to understanding people and really listening to them. Being a leader is to care for people, knowing how to motivate them, and empathizing with them. Many studies show that emotionally intelligent leaders have teams with higher employment engagement. The day I dropped out of medical school, I would have never imagined myself here giving a keynote speech at a women's leadership conference. I thought I was a failure and far from a leader, but in actuality, there was a better and more fulfilling path for me. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said, "The most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of those depths." I never thought that changing career paths would turn out to be one of my biggest blessings. My struggle became my strength and a source of help to others. I turned my pain into purpose. So I challenge you to feel the fear and do it anyway, just like the title of Susan Jeffers' book. Do something today that the future version of you will thank you for and give you a high five. Step outside your comfort zone because that's where the magic happens. As Neil Donald Walsh said, life begins at the end of your comfort zone. I know that many of you may be able to relate to battling with failure, uncertainty, anxiety, and just life issues. But I want you to know that you are not alone. And we are all in this together. You are stronger and more resilient than you can ever imagine. When you feel that there is no hope and no way out, just hang on a little bit longer and look inside yourself for that glimmer of light that just wants you to shine. Years from now, you will look back and see that struggle was actually a blessing in disguise, and you will smile, as I'm smiling now, knowing that you persevered and life does get better. A side effect of living is that we will face trials and tribulations, but how we rise up is what will define us. Don't let difficult times discourage you, but rather use that as fuel to catapult you onward and upward. Being brave isn't about facing easy times. It's about facing adversity and coming out the other side. There's a leader in all of you. There's a fire in all of you. And all you have to do is have the courage to light it. Thank you.
Thank you, Masuma. That was incredible. I really loved when you talked about how all of us have a leader inside of us. And I hope everyone here today will realize that after, the conference ends. I just want to take a second and introduce our next keynote speaker, Senna Sayyid. Senna is a cultural critic and currently a host and senior producer at the Washington, D.C. based Al Jazeera Plus. Al Jazeera Plus is a unique global digital news and storytelling brand dedicated to human rights and equality, holding power to account and amplifying the voices of marginalized communities seeking to make their stories seen and heard. We're very excited to have her. And without further ado, here's Senna.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. Also, FYI, I woke up this morning with a very stuffy nose and a lot of congestion. So I don't think that's one of the dreaded symptoms, but let's hope. Thank you so much, Masuma, for that really beautiful talk. Mine covers a few of the same themes, but as a journalist, I'm naturally a bit of a cynic. I hope, so your act will be very, very tough to follow in terms of inspiration. So I work in an industry not exactly famous for its handling of mental health. I'm a journalist, and currently I am, as it was mentioned, a host and senior producer with AJ+. I've been with the company now for 6.5 years, and I actually joined right before two major news stories dropped and developed, or actually in the midst of them, I should say, Michael Brown and Operation Protective Edge. Michael Brown's murder in 2014 led to the Ferguson Uprising, lending itself to the growing of the Black Lives Matter movement, which had set off 2 years earlier in 2012, following the murder of a child by the name of Tamir Rice. Operation Protective Edge was an asymmetrical assault by the state of Israel against a tiny strip of occupied and besieged land known as Gaza. This was my first job, job. I had freelanced for years up until that point, but this was my first time being in a newsroom in the midst of such great and unfathomable tragedy. And you have to understand that also experiencing news stories from the vantage point of a journalist in a newsroom is very different as an experience than simply being a news consumer. And I also want to clarify that I'm not here to speak on behalf of all journalists, of course, but unfortunately, there is sometimes a distance that we are forced to put between ourselves and the stories that we cover. I'm not talking about objectivity, which I think is, a journalistic myth, and we can talk about that outside the scope of this talk. I'm talking about how, in order to sometimes survive day to day as a journalist, as a person, as a human being, you need to create an emotional distance between yourself and the stories that you're either covering or that are being covered by your newsroom. That doesn't mean you approach a story detached from it. What I'm talking about, there's a difference between detachment and distancing. And when you're coming from any marginalized community based on your religion, ethnicity, gender, sex orientation, to be able to function on a day-to-day basis as a journalist in an era where we are constantly plugged into the news 24/7, you have an overflow of information coming at you from every direction. You can't even log on to Instagram, which I thought was the center of just pure vanity, but no, it's also a news center now. You can't even log on to Instagram without being bombarded by some sort of a news story. And so when you're constantly bombarded by all this information and you're a journalist, you need to build the skill of being able to distance yourself from the stories. Unfortunately, while it's a skill, it's not really a good one to have because you don't rid yourself of any emotions. You don't just move on. Oftentimes, those emotions that naturally come to you as a human being stay with you and they just continue to build inside. And it stays inside, but you keep the distance. I graduated from undergrad in 2009, and I graduated into a broken economy created by what we were then told was a once-in-a-lifetime economic collapse. That didn't age very well. I had decided to go to grad school. My original plan was law school, but I only applied to one law school and to one grad school. And I decided that fate, aka God, would determine my trajectory. And I didn't get into law school. I don't tell everyone that. Well, I didn't for a while. I do tell everyone now because I don't think there's any shame in it. And I think it's actually a funny reason why I didn't get into law school is because my French was not fluent enough. I had applied to a bilingual school, but I'm not quite sure why I exactly did that as someone who wasn't bilingual, like perfectly. This was a school in Montreal. And I did get into a fantastic grad school program, and I consider it one of the greatest blessings of my life. Much to what Masuma was saying, sometimes the things that can seem like disappointing in the moment can actually end up becoming a great blessing for us. And grad school for me was not school. It was just so much fun. It wasn't fun. I had to read like about 1,000 pages a week. So it wasn't like a party, but I love that I had to unlearn everything that I had learned in life in terms of when it came to the way in which we just thought about the world. And I was very passionate. I've always been very passionate about how we talk about things, how we tell stories, how we tell our own stories, our own histories, and how we construct narratives. I was a young girl who came of age during the, quote, global war on terror, the height of the Patriot Act, and a world that in so many ways was much scarier than a lot of the days during the past 4 years. And journalism for me seemed like the logical place to end up. I was tired of seeing stories about my faith, my communities, people who looked like me, people who looked familiar to me, told in such a way where all these familiar things, all of a sudden, familiar things that are a part of who I was, what I believed, were rendered strange, unfamiliar, and just not us, not what I believed, not what I knew. And I understood at a very young age how the stories we can tell either dehumanize or humanize people, not just individuals, but entire groups of people. So I decided I wasn't going to go to journalism school, which is what you often hear, and a lot of journalists do end up going to journalism school. I went to grad school because grad school for me was a way in which I became a trained historian and understanding how history is told. And when you learn how history is told, how to read history, you also end up learning how to tell stories. Also really great for fact checking. And I went into an interdisciplinary program, one that my mom went like, you went from wanting to go to med school all of a sudden to doing Islamic studies? Yes, absolutely. And I focused on history, as I mentioned. I left grad school in 2011 and I thought, all right, I'm gonna land a job like within 3 months. I thought I was gonna be living back at home with my parents again for just 3 months. I was there for 3 years in the Canadian boondocks of Northern Alberta. I'm a Canadian, FYI. I knew no one in that entire town of 2,500 people except my parents. And let me give you a little bit of also just context. Like when I mean the boondocks of Canada, like I really do mean like we're far up north. It's about an 11-hour drive to Alaska. So, that's pretty far up north. And during the winter, our winters would last about 8 to 9 months almost. Experiencing snow in the middle of April, May, totally normal. And the coldest I experienced, was probably minus, now this is Fahrenheit, I'm converting it, which is very similar, was a minus 54 Fahrenheit. It was the coldest that I've ever experienced, and no one should ever have to experience that ever. I worked as a cashier during the day for my parents' store. And at night I was freelancing. So here I went to an extremely, prestigious Canadian school. I had a grad degree and I was working as a cashier. And in my head, initially I was like, is this what I went into debt for? Like, really? And that was, something, that experience ultimately was very, very humbling. And again, it was a massive blessing. Those 3 years when I was experiencing them didn't always feel like a blessing. But in retrospect, having 3 years to spend with my parents again, and in a small town, it was a nice kind of a knock off my, to be knocked off of a high horse and be really humbled in many incredible ways. So at night I was freelancing. I was doing random writing projects because that's my background is as a writer. I had no experience as a video producer, and I'll get more into that shortly. I was doing these random writing projects with little to no pay. This was 2011 to 2014. Pay me weren't words that existed in my lexicon. And I kept having a lot of bad luck, or so I thought, bad luck at the time. But in retrospect, again, they were all blessings. I would get job offers, and then for some reason I would lose them. They would be rescinded or something would happen. And it didn't make sense to me during those 3 years. Again, I was like, wait, I've spent so much time, I've invested so much of my energy into this very particular trajectory in my life, this career, and nothing is panning out for me. Even jobs where I like that seem so perfectly fit for me, and I get them, and then something happens and the job offer is rescinded because of budgetary issues or visa issues or whatever. Then in about late 2013, I got a DM on Twitter. And this is probably the most successful slide into my DMs that has ever happened. An Al Jazeera anchor I had long followed told me that they were starting a new project in San Francisco and would love it if I would bring my wit and charm, his words, not mine, to it. 6 months later, I was in San Francisco. I was a writer. I had zero video production experience. And here I was as a producer for a digital video news company. For those of you who are familiar with AJ Plus, and for those of you who aren't, just a really quick background, we actually are considered, not to brag, but we are considered kind of the pioneers in digital news experience, right? So we were the first company to natively upload onto Facebook video. We really helped revolutionize what it meant to consume news digitally and on social media platforms in particular, so you can thank and curse us simultaneously. So I basically had to learn video production on the job. I knew how to write a script, or sorry, let me rephrase. I knew how to write. I didn't know how to write a script for video, because writing a 4,000 word essay is very different than writing a 2-minute video script. And I had to learn that. And I had to also show, because even though the guys who had hired me knew that, and they were like, look, we believe in your abilities, and which is incredible that honestly, that these guys decided to take a chance on me when, in an industry where very few people will look at your resume if you don't have the relevant experience. And it's a massive blessing that I was kind of given an opportunity by people who just thought I had the potential, even if I didn't have that specific experience. But I had to pretend that I knew what the hell I was doing on the job, because I was working with these incredible video producers with so much experience who had gone to the most prestigious journalism schools. And I had to be like, yeah, I know exactly what I'm doing. And those first 2 months on the job, I was spending, and I'm not exaggerating, 12 hours a day in the office. I would show up. I wasn't getting paid overtime until one of my bosses was like, if you're here till 9 p.m., you should be getting overtime. And God bless him for letting me know. I did financially great that first 2 months because of all the overtime that I was clocking, until they were like, you need to ease up. But I would stay, and if I was given a very particular task, I would stay, and I'm like, okay, like, how do I do that? Like, they asked me to visualize this story. Okay, let me go through. I had all the logins to our agency feeds like Getty and Reuters, AP, and I would just sit there and I would look at all the images, and I would think about, okay, does this image tell this story well? Does it correspond with what we're seeing? How is the exposition? And I would honestly just sit there and study images and videos until I had what I felt was a really good understanding of how to tell a story visually. And very quickly, and by the way, in my first 2 months, 2 of the stories that I had to cover, actually the very first story that I covered really randomly was like legalization of marijuana, which as someone who like has no experience in that like department, I was like, okay, all right, let's do this. But the 2 of the first major stories that I had to cover were actually, so the assault on Gaza and the Ferguson Uprisings. And coming from a writing background where I didn't have to deal with visuals, all of a sudden I had to deal with visuals. And I had to deal with traumatic visuals. I had to deal with visuals of death, despair, of injustice, in a way that I hadn't, and I had to engage with these images in a way I'd never been able to engage with before. And immediately I had to learn, unfortunately, that distancing that I mentioned. On a positive side, I quickly became one of the fastest producers on my team. And within 5 months, they had me very awkwardly host my first video. I soon became a regular on camera. And today I am, as I mentioned, I'm a host and I'm a senior producer with this company that I've been at now for 6.5 years, which is really mind-boggling, especially when you're a millennial, because like I think the average time for us is 2 years at a company, like this generation's not loyal. And I've stayed as long as I have because I've actually been given an incredible amount of creative and editorial freedom, and been able to tell stories in a way that I know in this industry I could not have told. So at this point, you might be wondering, okay, Senna, like you started off by talking about creating distance between yourself as a journalist and the stories that you end up covering or being surrounded by, and then you start talking about career trajectory. What's up? Where are we going? This pandemic, COVID-19, has really disrupted that distance that we sometimes force, or always force, between ourselves as journalists and the story. We're not covering a story, we're in it, we're experiencing it. And in addition to kind of experiencing the collective loss that we've all experienced, right? In addition to experiencing the gross mismanagement of this pandemic by the outgoing, thank God, administration, in addition to losing thousands of people every single day. Just the other day, we hit a new milestone of 4,000 Americans dead from COVID-19. And I also want to really, really emphasize that the numbers that you hear, right? You hear 20 million cases of COVID-19. I'm making this a really quick PSA. The 20 million, cases of COVID-19, 2,000, 3,000 dead in one single day. Those are just the numbers that we know. According to the CDC, even though we have 20 million confirmed cases of COVID overall, the numbers are likely 50 million plus, because there are a lot of people who are unable to get access. I mean, they don't have access to healthcare. That's a massive issue in this country. They're unable to access, even if they do have any healthcare, they're unable maybe to access a hospital or anything of that sort, or get tested and so on and so forth. And honestly, again, it's shockingly easy to spread this disease. Just yesterday, I got actually news that an entire group of my friends may have been infected. So wear a mask and stay distant. So in addition to kind of dealing with all of this, with this imagery of like human beings, family members of people in freezers on streets in New York, right? In addition to all of that, I've in this past year had to deal with a number of deaths in my family due to COVID, including my uncle, who I was very close with. And I also ended up losing several other family members related to other reasons, including my grandfather just about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago. And for the first time, maybe ever, but especially in my career as a journalist, I've had to sit in and with grief. I've had to sit in a grief that I can't even begin to define in any other terms, but longing. I've never actually understood, I think, what grief was until this year, until I had to experience grief with everything that we've lost as a society, as a country, as individuals, with the grief that I've personally experienced in my own life. It's the first time I've understood that grief is this longing for more time, for one more conversation, maybe one more kiss, one more hug. And again, all of just that in the midst of everything else that has happened in 2020. I mean, even what just happened this past week, I haven't been able to fully process what happened on Wednesday in DC, where I live. Right down the street, I can look outside my window and I see the National Monument. You know, I haven't been able to process that. And it was so surreal. And it's not surreal because of the actions in and of themselves, because, whoa, how does that happen? I think for me, especially, that like, it's been so surreal because there's a very human part of all of us that says, when does this end? And I don't mean the Trump presidency that ends on January 20th. I mean everything that weighs so heavily on our backs. I'd like to say that I persevered and remained resilient throughout this past year, but that would be a lie. I'd be lying if I said that I was super strong and I didn't have my weak moments, that I wasn't constantly staring into this pit of despair. I'd like to be able to say that actually I was super productive in 2020. I learned how to bake bread, you know, or that I learned a new skill. I didn't. And that acknowledgement that I wasn't as resilient and as strong as I'm expected to be by myself and by others, in a way has become the greatest lesson that I've had as a human being, and as a journalist. Because what I learned is that the stories we cover, the stories we tell, are all stories that we all live in one way or another. We can be those who are oppressed or those who perpetuate the oppressions, but every story we tell, we are telling about ourselves. And once we confront that, once we understand that, we can begin to confront truths about ourselves and the world in which we live in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senna. Thank you for empowering us and enlightening us with your story. That was really, really great. It was really great to hear about your journey with being a journalist. And, you know, as us being an audience, it's nice to see your perspective with telling other people your story. So thank you. After listening to these two inspiring women and their stories, we want to know how you are all feeling. Are you excited for what's to come for our next sessions? Are you feeling empowered? We want you to let us know by clicking on the link in the Zoom chat. This will take you to a website called Padlet, where you can anonymously post your words, post your thoughts, post your feelings, and everyone's post will be captured and mirrored for all of you to see. So let's go ahead and click on that link in the chat. And if we can, okay, here are all the answers pouring in. Awesome. Maybe you can all let us know how you felt. One thing that you took away from Senna and Masuma's keynote speech. Great. Thank you guys so much for participating. I'm loving these answers.
I love that there's a fighter within each of us. Being a young high school student, it's great to hear empowering words from both. Thanks. Wow.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Right. Let's go. I love that.
Being adaptable is a strength. Okay, well, awesome. Thank you. Please feel free to continue commenting on the Padlet as we go through. I just wanted to take a second and say, if you liked our programming that we have here today, our next event is on February 25th. It's a deliberative dialogue series on lessons in activism, the life of Malcolm X. We've got a great panel planned for that, and that will also be on Zoom and open to the public. So if you would like to attend, follow us on Instagram or, look for our Facebook page for information on how to register. And I just wanted to take a second and thank everyone, thank both Senna and Misuma for their incredible speeches. Thank everyone for attending.